I should tell you first that I was the last person who expected to be telling this story. For 40 years I have built things in this valley. Cabins, barns, root cellars, chicken houses, a schoolhouse in 1894 that is still standing if you care to see it. I have built in weather that would make a reasonable person weep, and I have built on ground that did not want to be built upon. And I have been wrong about materials and wrong about angles and wrong about load distribution more times than I will ever admit to a client. But in 40 years of building, I have been wrong about a person only once. Her name was Britta Lund. She came to the Red River Valley in the spring of 1876 with her husband Eric and their son Jonas, and she left alone in 1885. And what she built in the winter between those two facts was the most sensible structure I have ever seen. I called it a chicken house. I said this to her face. She kept working and did not answer me, and that silence has taken me the better part of 4 decades to fully understand. You asked me about my work. This is my work. This is the truest thing I can tell you about it. You have to understand what the Red River Valley was in the autumn of 1878. Because if you do not understand the land, you will not understand why what Britta did was so difficult to see. The valley is flat. I do not mean gently rolling or open or wide. I mean flat the way a table is flat the way something is flat when the flatness was made deliberately, though nothing made it deliberately. It is simply what it is. You can stand at the door of your house on a clear morning and see for 12 miles in any direction, and the horizon is a ruled line. There is no hill to put your back against. There is no slope to use. There is nothing between you and whatever the sky decides to do, and what the sky decided to do in Dakota Territory in 1878 was to be very cold for a very long time. We were mostly Swedes and Norwegians in that part of the valley, families who had come over in the decade after the war following the Homestead Act west. We had all known cold at home. Cold in Dalarna, where I was born, is a real thing, a proper winter that you respect and prepare for and then endure. But cold in Dakota is a different matter entirely. Cold in Dakota is flat, like the land. It has nowhere to go and nothing to stop it, and it does not come at you from one direction the way a Swedish winter does. It surrounds you. The temperature on the morning of the 12th of January, 1879, that particular morning, which I will come to in time, was 41 degrees below zero by the thermometer at the land office in Fargo. I have been cold many times in my life. I have never been cold like that morning, and I hope not to be again. But I am getting ahead of myself. The journalist has his pencil out, and I am already at January when I should be at September, which is where the story starts. September of 1878 was when you began to count. Everyone in the valley counted in September. You counted your cords of wood the way a careful man counts his money, not because you were rich, but because you needed to know exactly how much you had and how long it had to last. The calculation was simple, and everyone knew it. A small house through a Dakota winter needed 3 cords at minimum, and a minimum was not a comfortable thing to be at. 4 cords let you breathe. 5 cords meant you had done well, and Helga Nordgren had 5 cords, and she had had 5 cords every September since 1869, and this was part of why people listened to her. Helga Nordgren had come to the valley before most of us. She was Norwegian from Telemark, and she had the particular quality of a woman who has seen things fail and learned from each failure without ever becoming defeated by any of them. Her husband, Niels, had been a capable man until a harvesting accident in 1875 left him unable to walk, and since that year, Helga had run their claim entirely on her own. She was 58 years old in the autumn of 1878, and she was the person you went to when you did not know something, and she was nearly always right. I was 39 that year, and I had my own place, a tight little cabin I had built myself when I arrived in 1865, improved each summer since, and I was proud of it in the way a carpenter is proud of work that has been tested by weather and found sufficient. I had 4 cords split and stacked by the 10th of September, which I considered respectable. Lars Bergstrom, whose farm lay a mile and a half to the west of the main settlement, had 3 cords, which his wife Anna did not say anything about, but which I noticed her thinking about when it came up at the Sunday gathering. There were perhaps 20 families within a reasonable distance of Halstead that autumn. We gathered on Sundays at the Lindqvist place, which had the largest main room, and we talked about the ordinary things: weather, prices, the condition of the Fargo road, whose children were sick, whose animals had done well in summer. We talked about wood. It was at one of these Sundays in mid-September that someone mentioned that the Lund widow, out on the west edge, had not been seen cutting wood. Not chopping, not hauling, not stacking, nothing. I remember there was a pause in the conversation when this was said. Not a long pause. The kind of pause that happens when something is noted and set aside for later consideration. Britta Lund was 51 years old, which on the frontier in 1878 was not young. She had come from Småland in southern Sweden, the rocky part, where the farms are small and the soil argues with you. She was a compact woman, not tall, with hands that showed her life clearly, wide across the knuckles, steady, the hands of someone who had been working them since childhood. Her husband Eric had died of a fever in the summer of 1877. Their son Jonas had left the following April. He did not say he was leaving permanently. He left a note that said the land was not his life, and he wished his mother well. And he had not written since. I did not know Britta well. She did not come to every Sunday gathering. Sometimes she came, sometimes she did not, and when she came she was present without being talkative. She listened more than she spoke. When she did speak it was to the point, and then she was done, and she did not revisit things once she had said them. I respected this without particularly understanding it. I thought of her, when I thought of her at all, as a woman managing her situation with a quietness that was either admirable or worrying, and I had not yet determined which. What I knew of her practical situation was this. The Lund claim was 160 acres of flat grassland on the western edge of our loose community, perhaps 1 3/4 miles from the Bergstrom farm and nearly 3 miles from where I lived. The original sod house that Eric had built when they arrived was adequate but not well constructed. I had seen it twice and noted the gaps in the wall courses and a roof line that was not properly supported at the west end. There was no timber on the claim. There was no timber within 5 miles of the claim. The nearest place to buy cut lumber was in Halstead, and lumber cost money. And by the autumn of 1878, Britta Lund had been running 160 acres alone for 1 full year with no son and no income beyond what the land produced. She had not been cutting wood because she did not have the money to buy it, and not enough standing timber on her land to cut. This was the situation. It was not unusual on the frontier. People arrived with plans that did not survive contact with the actual conditions, and the conditions in Dakota were more difficult than most people anticipated when they signed their homestead papers in a warm land office back east. What was unusual was what Britta chose to do about it. I rode past her claim on the 15th of September. I was returning from a job 3 miles to the north, a new family, a root cellar they needed before freeze, and the Lund property was on my way back. She was in the field east of the original sod house, perhaps 40 yards from it. She had a spade in her hands, not an axe, not a bucksaw, a spade. She was digging. I pulled up and watched for a moment. She was working in a methodical way, not frantically, not slowly, just the steady pace of someone doing work that needs to be done and knows how long it will take. She had marked out a rectangle on the ground with stakes and cord, perhaps 10 feet by 14. She was inside the rectangle, and she was down perhaps 1.5 feet. The spoil pile was to the north of the stakes, and it was already considerable. I called out to her. She looked up, shaded her eyes. I asked her what she was building. "A winter room," she said. I looked at the rectangle. I looked at the spoil pile. I looked at where we were, flat ground, not a slope in any direction, nothing to dig into, the way you might dig a root cellar into a hillside. I told her I would come by again when she had more of it up. She nodded and went back to digging. I rode home and did not think much more about it until the following week, when Lars Bergstrom mentioned at the Sunday gathering that the Lund widow was digging a hole in the ground and appeared to be planning to live in it. There was a quality to how he said it, not cruel, but the way you speak about something that is puzzling and slightly troubling. Helga Nordgren asked how deep the hole was. Lars said he thought perhaps 3 feet by now, maybe a little more. Helga was quiet for a moment. Then she said she would ride out and see. I said I would come with her. We went on a Tuesday in the last week of September. The mornings were cold by then, frost on the low ground, the cottonwoods along the creek gone yellow. The sky had the particular blue of a Dakota autumn sky, which is not a gentle blue, but a very hard one, and the wind from the northwest had the first edge of what it would become in 2 months. Britta was working when we arrived. She was deeper now. I could only see her from the shoulders up when she was standing at the bottom. The spoil pile was large. She had been at this for 2 weeks, working every day from the look of it. She climbed out when she saw us. She was not winded. She set the spade against the spoil pile and waited. Helga walked the perimeter of the rectangle. She looked at the depth, which was close to 4 feet by then. She looked at the ground around it, the flat, open ground exposed to every wind. She pressed her boot against the side of the excavation and tested the soil composition, which was clay and hard-packed subsoil. She asked Britta what the walls would be. Sod, Britta said. 3 courses. Helga asked about the roof. Sod on timber, Britta said. 8 inches packed. Helga looked at the open sky above us. She looked at the original sod house, which was perhaps 40 yards away, its roof sagging slightly at the west end. She looked at Britta. The snow will come into that excavation before you have it roofed, Helga said, and when the spring melt comes, you will have water on your floor. And this ground, she gestured at the flat expanse around us, the wind does not stop here. You know that. There is nothing to stop it. Britta said she had thought about the drainage. She had thought about the wind. Helga said, I have watched 3 people die in this valley because they were certain about something that was wrong. I do not want you to be the 4th. Britta looked at her. Then she said, I know. Thank you, Helga. Nothing else, just that. I stood at the edge of the excavation and looked down into it. 4 feet of dark Dakota soil, the walls cut clean, the floor leveled by hand, and I said the thing that I have thought about every day for 40 years since. I said, this is not a cabin. This is a Hundshus you have pushed underground. Britta looked at me. She did not react. She picked up the spade. We rode back to the settlement. I told myself I had said the true thing. I had been doing this work for 16 years. I knew what held and what did not. I knew this ground and this cold and what was required to survive them. I was not wrong about any of that. I was only wrong about her. There is a question I should have asked Britta Lund in September of 1878, when I stood at the edge of her excavation and looked down into 4 feet of clean-cut Dakota soil. I should have asked, where did this come from? Not the labor. I could see the labor. I could see 3 weeks of digging in the size of the spoil pile and the condition of her hands when she climbed out to meet us. I mean the idea. Where does a 51-year-old widow from Småland, standing on the flattest ground on the continent, arrive at the decision to put her house into the earth rather than on it? I did not ask because I thought the question had an obvious answer, which was that she did not know what she was doing. That was the answer that fit everything I already believed. When you are 39 years old, and you have been building in a territory for 13 years, and no one has ever seriously questioned your judgment, you develop a particular habit of seeing. You look at something unfamiliar, and you measure it against what you know, and if it does not match, you call it wrong and move on. I moved on. I should not have. It was not until the following April, after the winter, after everything, that I rode back to her property with a notepad and a carpenter's rule and finally asked the question I should have asked in September. By then I had reason to ask it carefully, and she had reason to answer it fully. And what she told me that afternoon changed the way I thought about this work for the rest of my life. The memory came from her father, not from a book, not from another builder, not from any deliberate instruction. From her father, who was a smallholder in Småland, in the rocky southern country of Sweden, where the soil is thin and the farms are small, and you learn very early that the land will not give you more than it has, but it will give you everything it has if you pay attention to it. Her father kept a storage building set into a slope behind the house. Not a hillside exactly, more of a rise, perhaps 8 feet higher than the surrounding ground. He had built the back wall of the structure into that rise, so that 3 sides of the building were below the level of the earth, and only the front wall and the door were exposed. He used it for potatoes, for root vegetables, for the things that needed to stay cool in summer and needed to not freeze in winter. Britta was 9 years old during the worst winter of her Småland childhood. She did not remember the year precisely. She remembered the cold, and she remembered that the wooden shed where they kept the turnips froze solid in January, and everything in it was lost. And she remembered her father sending her to the storage building, the one built into the slope, to bring back a sack of potatoes. She was 9. She opened the door expecting the particular misery of frozen storage, the stiff air and the frost-coated walls. Instead, the air inside was still, not warm, not the warmth of a heated room, but not cold either. The way she described it to me, sitting in her main room that April afternoon while I held my notepad and forgot for long minutes to write anything down, was this: the air inside was the temperature of a living thing. She reached into the potato bin. The potatoes were firm, not frozen, not even close to frozen. She stood there for a moment, 9 years old, in her father's storage building in Småland, and she put her hand against the back wall, the wall that went into the earth, and it was warm, not dramatically warm, not fire warm or body warm, the warmth of something that had been holding heat for a long time, quietly, without anyone asking it to. The warmth of patience. Her father, when she asked him about it later, said, "The earth does not forget summer." He said it the way a man says something he has always known and has never particularly thought to examine. It was simply true, the way the weight of water is true or the direction of a prevailing wind. Something you account for without theorizing about. She did not think about this for 30 years. Then her husband died. Her son left. The wood money was gone. October was coming, and the calculation did not work, and she stood in the original sod house one morning in early September and looked at the walls and tried to find an answer in them and found nothing. The walls were gaps and drafts, and a winter she was going to lose. She went outside. She stood on the flat ground of her claim and looked west and north and south and saw nothing but grass and sky and the long, flat promise of a cold she could not afford to fight. She looked down at the ground, and the memory came back to her, not as an idea she developed, as a sensation she had been carrying for 42 years and had simply not opened until now, the warmth of her father's wall under her 9-year-old hand. The potatoes, firm and alive, in January. She told me I did not know if it would work here. The ground is different, the land is different, but I knew what the ground had done in Småland, and I knew I had nothing else. She paused then. She looked at her hands. "So I decided to ask it," she said. The design, such as it was, she worked out on paper over 3 evenings. Not architectural drawings. She was not trained for that, and did not pretend to be. What she made were more like lists, calculations, the kind of thinking a practical person does when they are trying to solve a problem with the materials available to them and no others. She wrote down what she needed. Warmth through 5 months of winter. She wrote down what she had. Flat ground, clay subsoil, field stone, salvaged timber if she could find it, her own labor. She wrote down what she did not have. money for cut lumber, money for a proper stove, money for the cordwood the winter would otherwise demand. Then she worked backwards. A conventional sod house, she understood from living in one for 2 years, lost its heat in 3 ways. Through the walls, which were sod and not particularly thick and had gaps that the wind found. Through the roof, which was a single layer over rough timber and did not hold much. And through the floor, which was packed dirt and in midwinter was cold enough to pull the heat right out of your feet. The original house sat on the surface of the ground. It sat on the cold, not in the warmth. She wrote, "Go down." The question was how far. She did not have the language of soil temperature gradients. She had the memory of her father's building and the particular quality of a wall 4 or 5 feet below the surface of the Smoland earth in January. She decided on 4 feet as a minimum and 6 feet as what she would aim for if the soil allowed it. She wrote the dimensions, 10 feet by 14, small enough that her body heat would contribute meaningfully to the interior temperature, large enough to live in through a winter without losing her mind. She wrote, "South-facing door and window. Dark stone around the frame." This was instinct, more than calculation. She had noticed in Smoland how the stone walls of south-facing buildings held the afternoon light longer than wooden ones. She did not know why. She intended to use it. She wrote on the last page of her notes a line I saw when she showed them to me that April: walls from earth, roof from earth, cold from earth, warm from earth. It was not a theory. It was a question she was proposing to ask the ground, and she was prepared to wait for the answer. The digging took longer than she planned because of the clay. The first 2 feet of Dakota topsoil came up without difficulty, dense with root mat, but workable with a good spade, and Britta had a good spade. Eric had bought it in Fargo the summer they arrived, and it was well made, Swedish steel on an ash handle, and she had maintained it properly. At roughly 30 inches, the spade stopped. Not slowed, stopped. The blade rang against something that was not stone but had the resistance of stone. She cleared the loose soil away with her hands and exposed the layer beneath. Blue clay, dense and plastic, the color of a winter sky just before snow. She pressed her thumb into it. It gave perhaps 1/8 of an inch and no more. She stood in the excavation for a while, looking at this. She could stop here. 30 inches was something. 30 inches of subgrade was better than nothing, and the ground temperature at 30 inches was warmer than the air in January, and perhaps it would be enough. She decided it would not be enough. The calculation required 4 feet. She went back to Hallstatt the following morning and returned with a cold chisel and a short-handled mattock she borrowed from Lars Bergstrom, who asked what she needed them for and accepted without particular comment her answer that she had encountered hard ground. The blue clay took 4 more days for 2 feet of depth. She worked it section by section, scored the surface with the chisel, mattocked out the loosened material, cleared it, scored again. Her shoulders ached in a way she had not felt since the early years of the Smoland farm when she and Eric had broken new ground for the first time. She did not stop. By the end of the 4th day, she was 6 inches below the clay layer and into the stable subsoil beneath it, which was compact and dark and held the shape of her cuts cleanly. She stood at the bottom of the excavation and took a breath and released it slowly. Her breath did not miss. It was the end of September, and the mornings were close to freezing. On the surface, in the open air, her breath had been visible since the first week of the month. Here, at the bottom of a 4.5-foot excavation, it was not. She stood there for a moment with her hand pressed flat against the east wall of the excavation. The soil was cool, not cold. The distinction was everything. She climbed out and went back to work. The sod cutting began in the first week of October. She used Eric's sod knife, a long flat blade on a short handle, made for cutting the prairie's root mat cleanly. The technique was one she knew from building the original house. Mark your cut, run the blade straight down 6 inches, then angle it to undercut. The block comes free in one piece if you have cut it right, a dense, dark rectangle of root-bound earth that holds its shape when you stack it. She cut from the meadow south of the excavation where the root mat was thickest. Each block was roughly 12 inches by 12, 4 inches deep, and weighed perhaps 8 pounds. She cut 140 of them the first day and stacked them close to the excavation. The following day she cut 120 more. Then she began to lay them. The first course went directly on the subsoil at the base of the excavation walls, fitted against the cut earth face. She set each block root side out, packed the joints with loose soil, tamped the top surface with the flat of the spade. The second course she offset by 6 inches, each block centered over a joint below, the way you lay stone. The third course she angled inward by perhaps 2 degrees, a slight batter that she introduced not from any principle she could have named, but from the instinct of her hands, which understood load and weight and the way a wall that leans into itself is more stable than one that stands straight. I noted this angle when I measured it in April. I measured it 3 times because I did not believe the first reading. The angle was not large, perhaps 2 degrees of inward taper over 30 inches of wall height. But it was structurally correct. It was the angle you would arrive at if you calculated the lateral pressure of the earth against the exterior of the wall and built to resist it. Britta had not calculated it. Her hands had known it. I asked her about this that April afternoon. She looked at the wall section I was indicating. She was quiet for a moment. The wall wanted to lean that way, she said. I let it. I wrote it down. I did not know what to do with it yet. I know now that it is the most precise description of good construction I have ever heard. You listen to the material, and you let it do what it knows how to do, and you work with that rather than against it. The walls were finished by the 3rd week of October. The roof timber, 5 salvaged joists, bought for $6 from a man in Hallstatt who had pulled them from a collapsed outbuilding, went up in 2 days. The sod roof followed, 8 inches, packed in layers, tamped hard, the grass roots facing up so they would continue to grow and bind the material together. It was not a beautiful roof, it was a functional one, and on the frontier in 1878, those were not different things. On the 23rd of October, with the first real cold of the season already moving down from the north and the sky the color of pewter from edge to edge, Britta Lund completed the construction of a structure that every qualified builder in the Red River Valley had already decided was a mistake. She was 51 years old. She had spent 6 weeks digging and cutting and hauling and stacking alone in a Dakota autumn. She had spent a total of $15. She had asked the ground a question. Now she had to wait for the answer. A structure is not finished when the walls are up and the roof is on. Any builder will tell you this. The walls and the roof are the visible part, the part that looks like completion from the outside, the part that makes a passerby think the work is done. But a building does not become a building until the small things are right, until the water runs where you intend it to run, until the air moves the way it needs to move, until the 10 dozen decisions that do not show from the outside have each been made correctly and tested, and where necessary, made again. Britta Lund knew this. She had lived in a building long enough to know the difference between a structure that was standing and a structure that was working. And on the morning of the 24th of October she stood inside her completed shell. Walls, roof, door frame, the single small window opening on the south wall still waiting for its glass, and looked at what she had and began the slower work of making it function. The first problem announced itself immediately. She built a small test fire in the firebox, a modest construction of fire brick she had mortared into the north corner with a salvaged iron flue pipe running up through the roof at what she had estimated was a workable angle. She used a handful of dry grass and 3 small sticks, enough to produce a visible smoke. She watched the smoke. It came back into the room, not all of it, perhaps half, a slow, rolling return of gray smoke that moved along the ceiling and began to settle. She stood still and observed this for a moment, then moved to the door and opened it to clear the air and went outside and looked up at the flue pipe where it emerged through the sod roof. The pipe was angled at roughly 45 degrees from vertical, a standard configuration, the angle she had settled on without particular deliberation, because it was the angle she had seen used on surface structures throughout the valley. On a surface structure with the prevailing northwest wind, this worked adequately. Here, with the pipe emerging at ground level, the sod roof was barely 18 inches above the surrounding grade. The geometry was different. The wind crossed the pipe opening at an angle that created a low-pressure zone on the downwind side, and the smoke, following the path of least resistance, came back down rather than rising. She sat outside for a while in the October cold, looking at the pipe. The solution was not complicated once she saw the problem clearly. The angle needed to change, not dramatically, but enough to shift the pipe opening away from the wind shadow it was sitting in. She needed the opening to face more directly into the prevailing wind rather than across it. She worked out the geometry in her head, which was the only place she had to work it out, and settled on a shallower angle, less than 45 degrees, perhaps 30, perhaps a little more. Adjusting the pipe meant disassembling the roof section around it, resetting the angle, and resealing the penetration. 2 days of work. The weather gave her those 2 days, a quiet spell, overcast but calm, the kind of mid-autumn pause that the valley sometimes offered before the serious cold arrived. She took the days and did the work, and on the evening of the second day, she built another test fire. The smoke went up. Not perfectly. There was a slight hesitation at the top of the pipe, a momentary curl back before the draft caught. She noted this and decided it was acceptable. Perfect was not available. Functional was what she had, and functional was what she needed. I want to be precise about something here because I have thought about it often. When I came to measure her structure the following April, I spent considerable time with that flue configuration. The angle she had arrived at, approximately 32 degrees from vertical, as best I could measure, was not one I had seen used before. But when I calculated the geometry of the prevailing northwest wind at ground level against the pipe opening at that angle, the numbers worked. The draft ran consistently up and out, regardless of wind speed, because the opening was positioned in the wind's face rather than across it. She had no instrument for this calculation. She had a problem and she had time, and she had the particular patience of a person who has decided to understand something rather than simply fix it. She sat outside in the October cold and watched how the wind moved across the roof surface and where the low-pressure zones formed, and she adjusted accordingly. 11 days for a pipe the length of my forearm. I asked her if she thought that was a long time. She considered this, then she said, "The smoke knew I did not understand it yet." I had to convince it otherwise. I put my pencil down when she said that. I have picked it back up many times since. The drainage problem she had anticipated and planned for before construction began, which was the right order to do things. Helga Nordgren's concern that the spring melt would send water into a below-grade structure and turn it into a pond was not unreasonable. On flat ground, without natural slope to carry water away, any depression in the surface will collect what falls into it. This is simply how flat ground works, and Helga had lived on flat ground for 9 years and knew it precisely. What Helga had not seen, because it had not been visible during our October visit, was the drainage work Britta had done before the walls went up. She had spent 3 days in early October cutting shallow channels in the ground around the building perimeter. Not deep trenches, but deliberate grades, 6 inches deep and angled away from the structure at roughly 1 inch of fall per 4 feet of run. The channels ran south and east, away from the door, and terminated in a low area of the meadow where water could spread and absorb without collecting. This was not complicated engineering. It was observation applied to a specific problem. She had watched the October rains and noted where the water moved on her claim, which low places collected it. which roots it preferred. Then she cut channels that agreed with those preferences and extended them in the direction she needed. In the spring of 1879, when the snowmelt came, the drainage ran exactly as she had intended. I checked it in April. The floor of the structure was dry. The base of the sod walls was dry. The channels were carrying meltwater south toward the meadow in a thin, steady sheet. Helga rode by that spring and looked at this without saying anything for a long moment. Then she said she thought about the water, that was all. But from Helga in the valley in 1879, it was a substantial thing to say. October gave way to November in the way of Dakota autumns, not gradually, but in a single day, when the character of the air changed entirely. I remember the morning. The 4th of November, I believe, though I would not stake much on the exact date. I stepped outside before sunrise to check my wood stack, which was a habit I had kept since my first Dakota winter, and the air hit me in a way that was qualitatively different from the day before. Not colder, particularly. The temperature was perhaps 28 degrees, which was not unusual for early November, but there was a weight to the cold that had not been present the previous week. A density, as though the air had stopped being autumn air and become winter air. And the change was not in the temperature, but in the intention. Old-timers in the valley had a word for this. The Norwegians among us used a term I could not pronounce correctly, meaning something like the cold that has decided. You felt it once and you knew it afterward. The season had made up its mind. By the second week of November, the creek had skimmed over at the edges. By the third week, the ground was frozen to a depth of 6 inches, and the sky had taken on the flat white quality that precedes serious snow. The families of the valley moved through their final preparations with the focused quiet of people who have done this before and know that the time for preparation has an end. I had my 4 cords stacked and covered. I had checked my window frames and stuffed the gaps with twisted rags soaked in linseed oil, a technique I had learned from a Norwegian carpenter in my first year who told me the oil kept the rags from rotting and made them more resistant to moisture penetration. My door fit tightly. I had planned it twice in October to get the fit I wanted. My stove was in good order. I was, by any reasonable measure, prepared. I thought about Britta Lund with a regularity that I did not entirely welcome. I had said what I believed to be true in October, and I still believed it, or told myself I did. But the image that came to me in the evenings when I looked at my stove and felt the comfort of a well-heated room was of a woman in an underground space with one small firebox and a flue pipe I had never seen used before, and it was not a comfortable image. I mentioned this to Helga one Sunday in mid-November. I said I had been thinking about the Lund woman and whether someone ought to check on her. Helga looked at me for a moment. Then she said, "I stopped by on Wednesday." I asked what she had found. Helga said she was packing snow against the exterior walls. I sat with this for a moment, packing snow against the walls. Helga said both sides, the north and west faces. She had a board she was using to tamp it down. Working in sections, perhaps 2 feet high, packing each section hard before she started the next. I tried to construct a sensible interpretation of this and could not find one. Snow against a wall meant moisture against a wall. Moisture against a sod wall meant the slow invasion of freeze and thaw cycles into the wall material, which meant degradation. It meant exactly the structural failure that any experienced builder in the valley would predict. I said something to this effect. Helga listened and did not disagree with the technical point. Then she said, she was working very carefully. She had thought about it. This was not an endorsement. Helga was not a woman who endorsed things without evidence, but she was a woman who paid attention to how people worked, because how people worked was often more informative than what they said, and she had noted that Britta Lund was working carefully. I rode past the claim 2 days later. From the road I could see the north wall of the structure, or rather I could see the snow packed against the north wall, a long, low mound of white, dense, and even perhaps 2 feet high and 2 feet deep at the base, running the full length of the north face. The surface was tamped smooth. It looked almost deliberate enough to be intentional, which of course it was, though I could not yet understand the intention. I did not stop. I told myself I had seen enough. The third week of November brought the first real snow. Not the dusting that had come and gone since October, real snow, steady and purposeful, falling for 2 full days in the particular dry, fine-grained way that Dakota snow falls when the temperature is below 20 degrees. It did not drift dramatically. The wind was light. It simply accumulated evenly and without drama, until the valley floor was under 8 inches of cover and the sky showed no sign of being finished. On the second day of snow, I went out to split the day's wood and stood for a moment at my woodpile, looking west in the direction of the Lund claim, which I could not see from my property. The snow was still falling. The light was gray and low and even, the way light is in the middle of a heavy snowfall, with no shadows and no depth. Everything was the same temperature of white. I thought, she is in there now. I did not know what she was doing, or what the temperature was inside her structure, or whether the flue was drawing properly, or whether the snow berm was helping or harming. I did not know any of it. What I knew was that she had built a thing on uncertain principles with limited materials, and the winter had begun in earnest, and there was no longer any interval for adjustment or correction. The season had decided, for all of us. What I did not know then, what none of us knew, was that the winter of 1878 into 1879 was not going to be a standard Dakota winter. Standard Dakota winters were hard enough. What was coming was something the valley had not seen before and would not see again for many years. The signs had been visible to those who knew how to read them. The geese had moved south earlier than usual in the last week of September, in numbers that old Marta Johansson, who had been watching the seasons for 67 years across 2 continents, had noted quietly to herself and mentioned to no one because no one had asked. The ice on the creek had formed 3 weeks ahead of the typical date. The particular quality of the November cold, that density I have described, that sense of intention, had been more pronounced than usual, more settled into itself. The winter of 1878 was going to be the coldest on record in Dakota Territory. Not cold for a week, not cold for a month, cold through January with a persistence and an extremity that would test every structure in the valley and every person inside, every structure in the valley, and would answer, finally and without room for argument, the question that Britta Lund had asked the ground in September. But that was still 6 weeks away. In the third week of November, with the first real snow still falling and the temperature at 15 degrees and dropping, we were not yet at the crisis. We were at the approach to it, which has its own particular quality, its own particular demands. The approach to a Dakota winter crisis does not announce itself. It simply continues. It deepens. It waits to see what you have done to prepare, and it takes note. And in January it renders its judgment. The valley settled in. Fires were tended. Wood was counted. Children slept in their coats. On the western edge of the settlement, in a structure that sat 4.5 feet below the surface of the frozen ground, with walls of packed sod and a roof of packed earth and 2 feet of deliberately packed snow against its north and west faces, Britta Lund let her fire go to coals at 10 o'clock in the evening and pulled her wool blanket around her shoulders and lay down on the sleeping platform she had carved into the back wall. She put her hand against the earthen wall behind her. It was warm, not dramatically warm, not fire warm. The warmth of something that had been holding heat for a long time, quietly, without anyone asking it to. She had felt this once before. She had been 9 years old in her father's storage building in Småland, reaching into a potato bin on the coldest day of a Swedish winter. The wall had been warm then too, the same temperature, the same quality of patience. She was 51 years old now. She was alone on 160 acres of flat Dakota ground with a winter she could not afford coming down from the north, and the wall behind her was warm. The earth does not forget summer. Her father's words said the way a man says something he has always known, something you account for without theorizing about. She had asked the ground a question. The ground was answering. Outside, the temperature dropped to 4 degrees above zero. The snow continued to fall, dry and fine and even, covering the valley in its uniform white, finding the gaps in every window frame, testing every door, settling onto the packed snow berm along the north wall of Britta Lund's structure, and adding to it, insulating it further, making it denser and more effective with every inch of accumulation. The crisis was 6 weeks away. The answer was already here, held in the walls, patient and quiet and certain, waiting for January to make it undeniable. The 12th of January, 1879 began without wind. This was the first thing you noticed, and it was wrong in the way that silence in a room is wrong when you expected noise. Dakota winters were not quiet things. They came at you with sound as much as cold. The sustained moan of the northwest wind against the wallboards, the particular whistle it made through a gap you had missed in October, the constant low percussion of the house itself contracting in the cold. You learned to sleep through it. You learned to gauge the severity of a night by the pitch and volume of it. That morning, there was nothing. I woke before dawn to a stillness so complete I thought for a moment I had gone deaf in the night. I lay in my bunk and listened. Nothing. Not even the creak sound, which meant the ice had thickened enough to silence it entirely. I got up and looked out the window. Clear sky. Stars still showing in the west. The snow on the ground was undisturbed. Not a ripple in the surface, not a drift line. Everything flat and even and white and absolutely motionless. I put 3 pieces of wood in the stove and went back to bed and lay there with a feeling I could not immediately name. It took me several minutes to understand it. The feeling was dread. The wind was what moved the cold through the valley. Wind drove it against the walls, forced it through the gaps, stripped the heat from a structure the way running water strips dye from cloth. A night with wind was a hard night, but it was a familiar kind of hard. What was coming that morning? I did not know this yet, not in words, but my body knew it the way a body knows things before the mind catches up, was something different. The wind had stopped because the cold had gone past the point where wind was part of it. What was coming was cold in itself, absolute and still and indifferent, settling onto the valley like a weight placed deliberately on a scale. By mid-morning, the thermometer outside my door read 12 degrees below zero. By early afternoon, it read 22 below. The sky had gone white, not with cloud, but with a kind of atmospheric ice that hung above the valley floor in a thin, opaque layer, diffusing what little light the January sun provided, until the whole world was the same uniform pale gray from ground to sky. I kept my stove burning continuously. I had not done this before. I was careful with my wood. I burned efficiently. I managed my supply with the attention it deserved. That day I fed the stove without counting. I kept the interior of my cabin at roughly 52 degrees, which was not warm but was survivable, and every time I let the fire go down for an hour, the temperature dropped with a speed that clarified the situation precisely. I did not go out that afternoon. There was no reason to go out, and every reason not to. In the Bergstrom house, a mile and 3/4 to the west of my place, Anna Bergstrom's oldest child began coughing in the late afternoon. Eric was 7 years old, a thin, quiet boy who had his mother's eyes and his father's habit of observing things carefully before saying anything about them. The cough was the dry, tight kind that comes when the air inside a house has been heated continuously for days and all the moisture has been driven out of it. Dakota winter air was dry to begin with. A wood stove running without interruption made it drier still, and the interior of a sod house in January had the quality of the air inside a kiln, warm enough to survive in, but abraded of everything that made breathing comfortable. Lars Bergstrom had 2 1/4 cords of wood left. He had calculated in October that this would last through March with careful management. He was burning through his calculation faster than he had planned because the cold had come in harder and longer than the previous 3 winters, and careful management had given way to necessary management, which was a different thing. By the evening of the 12th, his necessary management meant the interior of the house was holding at 38 degrees without the children's sleeping room door open, and 41 degrees with it open, and his oldest son was coughing. Anna fed the children supper and put them to bed together, all 3 in the one bed, which generated enough combined warmth to make the arrangement workable, and sat in the main room and listened to the coughing and looked at the wall and thought. She thought about a great many things in that interval. She thought about her wood supply and her children's health and the 14 weeks remaining until April. She thought about whether to ride to Helga Nordgren's in the morning and whether Helga would have room and whether asking would feel like failure, and whether failure was a category that still made sense in a winter like this one. And she thought in the particular way that a person thinks about something they have been watching from a distance for 4 months without letting themselves form a complete thought about it, about the structure on the western edge of the settlement, the low one, the one that seemed to have grown into the ground rather than out of it. She had watched it through her east-facing window since September without knowing exactly what she was watching for. Something had kept her looking. She got up at 9 o'clock in the evening and put on her coat and her husband's coat over it and her wool scarf and her heaviest mittens. Lars was already asleep. He had been up before 4 that morning to tend the animals. She lifted Eric from the bed without waking the other children and wrapped him in the wool blanket and held him against her chest. Lars had told her once, in the early months of their marriage, that she made decisions the way water moved, without announcing itself, simply finding the way that was open and taking it. She had not thought of this in years. She thought of it now, standing at her door in the dark, her son breathing wetly against her shoulder. She went west. The thermometer at the Fargo land office recorded 41 degrees below zero at 4:17 in the morning of January 13, 1879. This was the lowest temperature recorded in Dakota Territory up to that date. I did not know this figure until weeks later, when word came through from the county seat. What I knew on the night of the 12th was that my stove was consuming wood at a rate that frightened me, and that the interior of my cabin, a cabin I had built myself over 13 years with every improvement I knew how to make, had dropped to 31 degrees by 2 in the morning, despite a fire I had not let go out for 18 hours. 31 degrees, 1 degree below freezing, inside a structure I had been proud of, with a fire burning continuously. I put in 2 more pieces of wood and pulled my blanket to my chin and lay in the dark and did the arithmetic of my wood supply and did not enjoy the result. I thought about Britta Lund. I could not help it. I had been not thinking about her for 4 months, with increasing effort, and on the night of the 12th the effort finally exceeded what I was willing to spend on it. I thought, she is either warm or she is dead. I thought, I do not know which, and I will not know until morning, and there is nothing to be done about it before then. I put more wood in the stove. I did not sleep again until nearly 5. Anna Bergstrom arrived at Britta Lund's door at approximately 9:30 in the evening. She told me this the following spring, sitting at Britta's table while I measured the walls and wrote in my notepad and tried to keep my handwriting steady. She told it plainly without embellishment, the way she told most things. She said she knocked twice, and the door opened almost immediately, as though Britta had heard her coming across the frozen ground. Britta stood in the doorway in a wool shirt, no coat, her hair loose. Behind her, the interior was dim, a single tallow candle on the shelf, but not dark, because the light from the candle behaved differently in that space than it did in a surface house. It reflected differently off the earthen walls. It made the room appear larger than it was and warmer than the temperature strictly warranted. No fire. Anna registered this first. The firebox held coals, orange, low, nearly spent, but no active flame. The fire had been banked for hours. The air that came through the open door was warm, not hot, not the aggressive heat of a roaring stove. The warmth of a room that had been holding a comfortable temperature for a long time without being asked to maintain it by force. Anna said it was the warmth you feel when you enter a root cellar in summer, stable even, slightly dense, as though the air itself had weight and texture. She said she stood in the doorway for a moment and simply breathed it. Britta looked at the child against her chest. She stepped back from the door without speaking. Anna came in. She set Eric on the sleeping platform, the one carved into the back wall, the one I would measure in April and find to be precisely positioned to benefit from the thermal radiation of the east wall. She unwrapped the blanket from around him, and he stirred but did not wake. His breathing was already quieter. The dry, abraded quality that had been in it for days was easing, because the air in that room had a moisture content that the air in a wood-heated surface house did not. Underground air holds humidity differently. The earth around the walls contributed a slight, steady exhalation of moisture that the stove's dry heat never stripped away entirely. Anna sat on the edge of the platform and placed her hand flat against the back wall. She held it there. I asked her, the following spring, what it felt like. She was quiet for a moment. She is not a woman who speaks carelessly about things that matter. She said, "It felt like putting your hand on the back of an animal that is sleeping, something alive that is not doing anything except being warm." The wall temperature, as best I could calculate from the measurements I took in April, would have been approximately 51 degrees on the night of the 12th, 3 degrees above the ambient interior air temperature of 48. This differential is consistent with what earthen walls at that depth do when they are releasing stored heat into a cooler space. They run slightly warmer than the air they are warming, a slow and steady radiation that requires no fuel and makes no sound, and continues whether you are attending to it or not. The fire had been out since 8 o'clock. The wall was warm. Anna sat with her son on the sleeping platform and felt the wall with her open hand and said nothing for a long time. Britta put a small piece of wood on the coals, the first fuel added in over an hour, and by 10 o'clock the interior had reached 56 degrees, and Eric had stopped coughing entirely and was sleeping with the deep, slack heaviness of a child who has finally found the temperature his body needed. Outside, the thermometer was descending toward its record. Inside, the earth held what it had always held. I rode to the Lund claim on the morning of the 14th, 2 days after the record cold. The temperature had moderated to 8 below zero, which felt almost reasonable by contrast. The sky had cleared. The snow on the ground was undisturbed, and the snow berm along the north and west faces of Britta's structure had grown taller with the week's accumulation, nearly 3 feet now, dense and pale, seamless where it met the sod wall above it. I knocked. Britta opened the door. Anna Bergstrom was sitting inside with her son on her lap, both of them apparently comfortable, Eric eating something from a small bowl. Britta had a fire going, a modest one, a single piece of wood the diameter of my wrist, burning slowly in the firebox. I stepped inside. The interior temperature, by the small thermometer I had brought in my coat pocket, was 54 degrees. The exterior temperature was 8 below zero. I stood in the center of the room and held the thermometer and looked at the number and looked at the walls and looked at the number again. 62 degrees of difference between inside and outside, maintained by a fire that would not have heated the corner of my cabin. I asked Britta how much wood she had burned since the 1st of November. She considered this. She gestured to a corner where a modest stack of split wood stood against the wall. Perhaps 3/4 of a cord remained. She had started November with a cord and a half. All she could afford. She had burned 3/4 of a cord. In my cabin I had burned 4 cords since the 1st of November, and my interior temperature on the coldest night had dropped to 31 degrees. I put the thermometer back in my coat pocket. I looked at the earthen walls, which I had called a chicken house in October. I looked at the snow berm visible through the small south window, which I had thought was evidence of poor judgment. I looked at the flue pipe angled at 32 degrees, which I had never seen before and had assumed was wrong. I did not say anything for a long moment, then I took out my notepad. By April of 1879, Lars Bergstrom had begun expanding his root cellar without telling anyone he had decided to. Anna watched him from the kitchen window one morning and recognized the particular quality of his digging. Careful, deliberate, a man who has made up his mind about something and is now simply executing it. She did not ask him about it. He did not explain. By August, the expanded space was complete. 8 by 10 feet, a small iron stove, a sleeping platform on the north wall. They used it that winter and every winter after. Lars told me in 1882 that it had cut his wood consumption by more than half. He said this without particular emphasis, the way a practical man reports a result that has proven itself sufficiently that it no longer requires defense. By the spring of 1880, there were 3 other structures in the valley with some form of earth integration in their winter rooms. By 1883, there were 9. No one used Britta's name in connection with any of them, including me. I am not proud of this. I include it because it is true, and because leaving it out would make the story more comfortable than it deserves to be. Helga Nordgren piled earth against her north wall in the autumn of 1880. She did not call it anything. She did not explain it to anyone who asked. She simply did it. In the methodical way she did everything. And that winter her wood consumption was lower than it had been in 11 years of Dakota winters. I asked her the following spring what had made her decide to try it. She was quiet for a long time. The kind of quiet that is not absence of thought, but the presence of too many thoughts being sorted carefully. Then she said, she thought about the water. She thought about everything. That was all. Britta Lund left the valley in the spring of 1885. I do not know where she went. I heard Sweden, and I heard Minnesota, and I heard Iowa, and I did not know which was true, and I did not pursue the question as thoroughly as I might have. She left without ceremony the way she had lived, without asking the valley to mark her departure or explain her arrival. Her structure is still standing. I drove past it last October on my way to a funeral in the western part of the county. The sod roof has become a small meadow, level even, grass thick and healthy, because the warmth from the interior has encouraged root growth for 40 years, and the roots have bound the material into something that weather cannot easily undo. From the road it looks like a low green mound in a brown autumn field, slightly incongruous, slightly beautiful, the kind of thing that makes you look twice without immediately knowing why. I got down from the wagon. I went to the door. The frame is still there, though the door itself is long gone. I went inside. The sleeping platform is intact, carved into the back wall exactly as I measured it in 1879. The flue pipe is gone. The firebox is cold and has been cold for 30 years. I put my hand against the back wall. It was not warm. I want to be accurate about this. It was October, and the structure had not been heated in 3 decades, and the wall was not warm in any dramatic sense. But it was not cold either. It was the temperature of the ground, which is what it had always been, which is what it will always be, regardless of what the air above it decides to do. I stood there for a while with my hand on the wall and thought about a woman I had called a fool, who had understood something I did not understand, and had waited without complaint for January to explain it to me. She was not an inventor. I have thought about this carefully for 40 years, and I am certain of it. She was not a genius or a visionary or any of the words we use when we want to make a person into a category rather than a human being. She was a woman from Smoland who had lost her husband and her son and her wood money, who stood on flat Dakota ground in September and looked down instead of sideways and remembered what her father had told her about the earth. She asked the ground a question. The ground answered. She built the answer into walls and a roof and a drainage channel and a flue pipe angled at 32 degrees, And then she waited for winter to make the answer visible to people who had not thought to ask. We are not always the quickest to learn from the right teachers. This is a thing I know about people, having been one for 79 years, having been wrong about the most important structural question of my professional life by a woman who never had a professional title or a professional credential or a single person in the Red River Valley who expected her to know what she knew. Put her name in your article. Britta Lund. L-U-N-D. She was 51 years old, and she came from Småland, and she built the most efficient structure I have ever seen in 40 years of building in this valley. I called it a chicken house. Write that too if you want. It is the truth. It is the least I owe her.